So with that, I think we will get started. Welcome everyone to today's broadcast. It's around new grading workflows for sites, more specifically commercial sites, so ponds and parking lots and that sort of thing. This is all in Civil 3D, highlighting a new tool set that we are releasing in just a couple weeks. My name is Brian Lewandowski. I'm the Civil Product Manager here at CTC. I live, breathe, and eat Civil 3D every day, and now I get to make software to try to make it work better for all you guys out there. So this new tool we're releasing in a couple weeks, this is what is going to really change how you guys do site grading in Civil 3D. And I gave a little introduction to it a few weeks back, but I'm going to dive in a little deeper with one of the specific kind of target project types today. So what Autograder is, though, is it's something that works with the native tool set in Civil 3D. It works with feature lines. You're all used to feature lines. Feature lines are great. They're flexible. They're easy to work with, a small, quick learning curve, but they're not dynamic. So what Autograder does, one of the first things, one of its primary things, is to link sets of feature lines through what we call grading families. So a grading family might be curb and gutter, right? You often have a 3D offset between one feature line and a set of other ones, and that's how a lot of the grading works that you're doing. As you make changes to your design, okay, so if you draw a feature line and then you want to use Autograder to duplicate, say, a pond example where you've drawn the top of the pond, and you want it to generate your benches and different slopes all the way down or all the way up the pond. If you make a change to that feature line you drew and you refresh Autograder, all those dependent feature lines will update. Autograder manages all your surfaces too. This is another big headache in Civil 3D, right? You create these feature lines, you edit them. You got to keep adding them to the surface all the time, and you're going into surface properties and you're kind of managing those settings, perhaps removing break line definitions. Autograder manages all of that as well for you. It takes care of feature line styles and layers, so we're not having to think about and set this stuff all the time. We just specify it in the grading family or in the app-wide options, and it'll automatically create these feature lines, put them on the style we assign, the layer, and in the site that we assign. And as we create these grading families, we can save out templates to be used on other drawings and other projects. So there's three different types of ways you can use Autograder. One is where you do what we call parallel offsetting, or it's basically running the stepped offset command, but it does it for you based on a saved set of parameters. Okay, so I'll reiterate this. What Autograder does is it's working with native objects and tool sets in the software. This is a big thing. We didn't want to create something proprietary that was entirely different from what you guys were used to, and that wouldn't be compatible with what you're using now. The second type is a perpendicular, where it'll automatically generate feature lines based on a primary, or what we're going to call a parent feature line. So this might be a residential example where it's drawing out perpendicular feature lines. Then the third one is where it would insert templates, be they building pads or concrete pads or something like that, some kind of relationship to a parent feature line where it would automatically insert all of these. What we're going to focus on today is this parallel one, and this is, frankly, I think probably going to be the most commonly used one and the most popular one, because it has so many applications in our focus today, which is around commercial sites. So with that, I'm going to jump into Civil 3D and start showing you Autograder and how we might use it in a site grading workflow. And what I'm starting off here is, what I've got is some polylines drawn representing the geometry of my site. I've got curb lines here. These are in the salmon color, It represents the horizontal layout of my parking lot, so I've already done that. And I've got some base geometry for perhaps a berm over here. Maybe there's a pond to the north of the site. I've got my current building outline in here. And one of the things I still recommend, even with Autograder, because what we're doing with Autograder is manipulating a lot of feature lines, a lot of elevations for you at once. Some of you may have used this before, this concept of a setup surface or a grid surface. And that concept, if you use it, it plays really nicely into Autograder. If you don't use it, fine. But I want to show you how that would also be incorporated in here. Some people use it and then they stick with it throughout their grading. Other times they use it just to get some preliminary elevations for their curb lines, and then they kind of abandon that. So what is this setup surface? I'm going to take just a couple minutes, explain what this is, how we use it, and then we'll go on to using Autograder to grade out the rest of the site. So a setup surface is basically a surface that's quite simple, and it's made up of perhaps a grid of feature lines that encompass the vast majority of your parking lot. The reason we do this is because parking lot grading, the sloping can be fairly simple, but because the horizontal geometry is fairly complex, you end up managing a lot of little elevations across all of your site, right? All these PCs and PTs and all these PIs across all these curb lines, it gets really tedious, right? So if you instead generate a simple surface like this, and then you pull elevations from it, from your curb feature lines, it's a really quick way to assign elevations, okay? So again, not part of the Autograder tool, but something that I've used in many different ways over the years, and I would certainly advocate for you guys to try it out. The beauty of it is that you can throw these grid feature lines, these are the orangish ones, into a simple surface and get a sense of the overall flow across your parking lot. So I'm going to go and use that surface to assign elevations to all of these salmon colored feature lines, and then we'll take advantage of Autograder to automate all the details in our curb. Again, this webcast is a focus around workflow, not just the features of the tools. So I'm going to be highlighting a couple other workflow recommendations that tie in nicely with Autograder. So to start with, I'm going to create feature lines from all of these polylines. Pretty simple, you guys have all done this. And a couple key things here. I'm going to take these feature lines, I'm going to put them in the same site as these orange dashed ones, okay? Which means they'll interact as they cross. But I'm going to use a feature line style that I call secondary. And what it means is if I assign this style that I've named as secondary, and the orange ones are set to primary, in my site properties, if I say primary governs, those orange feature lines will always control. So after we create these, I'll go ahead and show that to you. I'm going to create these feature lines. I'm going to assign elevations. Okay, just standard behavior you guys are used to. And I'm going to pull elevations from this parking setup surface. And I'm also going to make it relative to that surface. This is a new feature that's been added in the last few years. Okay, I'm going to hit OK to that. And now it's pulling elevations from that surface. If you guys haven't used this, it's pretty straightforward. It just means it sticks to the surface. See, it says relative to surface over here, and all elevations come from that surface. I want to mention that setting quick. This is something I see a lot of people not aware of. And so if we go into our grid and parent site, that's where the orange and the now salmon feature lines are. If you right-click on feature lines, you can go to properties, and you have a settings on the options tab in here for feature line crossings. If you set primary, which I have the orange ones set to, that's a primary feature line style. If you set that above secondary, that means any changes to the orange ones will automatically force the salmon colored ones or the ones with the secondary style to follow it. Okay, nifty little feature there if you're not aware of it. It plays in nicely with a lot of different site grading workflows. let's go ahead and grab this feature line right here. I'll highlight more specifically. Right here, there's a crossing. In fact, when I use Quick Elevation Edit and I hover over this, you notice that that triangle is grayed out. It's a little hard to see, but it means that there is a PI point there, but I can't edit it. It's being controlled by the orange line. I can't edit the salmon color line at that point. And if we want these feature lines to stick to the parking surface, that's what we'd want to do, okay? That's the workflow I'm showing here. What's the alternative? Don't make this relative to the surface, and don't put these in the same site. Take your elevations from your setup surface one time as kind of a starting point, and then if you do more independent grading of those feature lines, run with that. So two different ways to handle it, but I'm going to show you how to do it kind of the most dynamic way. Oftentimes, though, the more dynamic it is, the less flexible it can be. Okay, a couple things. I've got some points that are sitting outside of the grid surface, so I'll go ahead and just set those to match my existing surface. And I'll do the same down here. And then down here, I've got a couple points. I'm going to set that to match my finish grade of my my finished floor elevation. Okay, so what are these salmon color lines? They represent my gutter lines in my curb. Okay, so the grid surface or the parking setup surface is my finish grade or my bituminous, my driving surface. Now we've got some preliminary grades on these feature lines. Now is where Autograder comes in, and this is the focus of today's webcast. We need to do, what would we normally do? We'd run stepped offsets on these things, right? Stepped offset 100 times over, right, on all these different feature lines to generate tops of curbs and lips of curbs and all that. And then when something changes, right, we have to redo all that stuff. Or maybe you're trying to use the grading tools. Those are great, right, until you make too many changes and then they disappear and they kind of bug out on you, right? Or maybe you're using corridors and you manage to go and get a PhD to figure that out, right? Really cool workflow, but really, really complex. And most people don't, for those reasons, don't want to use corridors for site grading. Corridors are much more oriented towards linear type projects. All right, so we've got these feature lines. Just to highlight, I'm going to grab this, do a select similar, and just so we get a quick visual on it. I've got these salmon gutter lines draped onto the parking setup surface, okay? Any change to those orange lines and the salmon colored lines will move with it. All right, Autograder, let's talk about that. We talked about different ways you might generate your curbs, all of them with a lot of drawbacks. What Autograder will allow us to do is to define a grading family. I'm going to come right over here in the main interface, click a new grading family, and here's those three types. I've got parallel, perpendicular, gives you a little visual, and a template insertion, okay? The blue are what we call parent feature lines, so those are the ones that are user created. The green represent child feature lines. That is what Autograder is going to make for us. Here's the perpendicular scenario and the template insertion. We're going to focus on parallel. And then I get a family editor window. And you can give this family a name. And then what parent feature lines are we going to build this off of? We could select them in the drawing, or we could go by filter. And in this case, I've got those feature lines out here set on the curb layer. Okay, if I use things like an asterisk or commas, I could reference multiple layers or everything that starts with curb. I hit OK, and now we see that I've got 6 feature lines that get pulled into Autograder in this way. Okay, if I'm doing multiple feature lines, I grade the full stationing length of that feature line. But if I chose one, then I have station control on individual feature lines. Okay, now we start spelling out what does this family look like. I told you these are gutter lines, right? So we want to generate a feature line for the top of curve and the back of curve, as well as the lip, or maybe you call it the flange or the flag of the curve. So you create what are called components inside your grading family. Each component is going to generate a feature line. I'm going to anchor it to the parent feature line. I'm going to go, what method do I want to choose? We bake in all of the different methods that you might be used to in the grading creation tools. We use that same kind of language, but all we're doing is generating additional feature lines for you. We're going to do a distance to relative elevation. And then which side do I want to offset on? I can do left or right, or inwards or outwards. So if I have closed feature lines like this, and I don't really know what left or right is, I could just tell it inwards or outwards. In this case, I've got feature lines drawn that are closed, as well as ones that are not. We're going to go to the left side with this. But if you chose the wrong one, it's not a big deal. You could go reverse your feature line, refresh your grading family, and it'll flip all of those child feature lines to the other side. So we're going to go a distance of 0.167, a relative elevation of 0.5. Notice, as I create this, I get this preview down here, this visual, this dynamic preview, so I understand what I'm creating. Now, it's not necessarily to scale. We're kind of working on how this behaves a little bit. It's not complete yet. But as I create this and build it out, you'll start to see basically what the template will look like. I'm going to do a back of curve, going to connect it to the top feature line. Notice now I can anchor it to not just the parent, but I can anchor it to previously created components. So I can really stack these up in any way I want. I'm going to run a distance at a slope to the left side, distance of 0.5 at 0%. Now we're starting to see my curve created there. Okay, you can run a copy right over here if you want, where this is creating new components. And what we want now is the lip of the curve. And this I'm going to attach to the parent because it's going on the right side. And we'll do a distance at slope again, go 1 to 2%. So you're kind of spelling out your cross-section, right? Your subassembly, so to speak, of your curve. Okay, this is what the geometry will look like. This is going to generate 3 feature lines at each and every one of these parent feature lines out here. Now, what does the styling look like for those? You go into the formatting tab here. It's telling me I've got 3 feature lines that are going to be created for each one of those. Here is the formatting. What's the default for the family? That's reading some settings and options. I'll show you that in a moment. But here's the top component. I want that to get this feature line style named child. I'm going to put it on a layer like this, and then I'm going to put it in a different site. So site management is important here because if I put it in the same site as these orange feature lines, what we used for the grid, and then I'm crossing that, they're going to want to interact with one another. So put it in a separate site. So you set this once, and then when this goes and creates dozens of feature lines, it'll always apply these format settings. Okay, I can save and close this, and now the family is saved into my drawing. These settings are saved per drawing. So if I close this drawing and reopen Civil 3D in this drawing again, this will be here when I open up Autograder. I had mentioned some of those formatting settings. If I look into the options window, this is the app-wide options. I've got choices for what the default feature line style, layer, and site is. So as I create new components, this is defaulted. Okay? This would be more like in line with your company standards. Set this here so that when you are generating grading families, this is just automated for the users. Okay, I'm going to click Run to this. All we've done so far is define the family. I'm going to click Run. And then you're going to see in the background here all these feature lines created for us. It's going to run the stepped offset command, I don't know how many times, 20, 30 times, based on that geometry we defined. Okay, let's close out of this. You can see what we have here. All these feature lines representing back of curb, top of curb, and lip of curb. Okay. Now, since we're done with this grid surface for the moment, I'm going to turn this off. And let's talk about surface settings a little bit in here. You might have seen that back in Autograder, we defined the family in the family editor window. But if you want this to manage your surfaces as well, it'll do that. And that's right here on the main screen. I can tell it to add all of these feature lines, including the parent feature lines, into the FG surface. And when it does that, what kind of break line settings do I want? Okay, so all those native settings you're used to seeing when you create break lines, those are all right here. So for example, I want some additional detail along my line segments and perhaps the mid-ordinate distance. This is how the surface triangulates along curves. Okay, I can spell that out right here. There's also weeding and other options as well. So I'll hit OK to that. And I'm going to run it again. But this time, all the feature lines are going to get added to my FG surface. So one question came in, is it possible to define these grading families in an AutoCAD template? Yeah, a DWT or DWG, basically the same thing. When you define these, the metadata for this, we save that to the DWG. It doesn't affect your drawing at all. It's third-party developers can write metadata like this into DWGs, and then if you launch our app, the app can understand those instructions and create that. So yeah, you can save it into your DWTs if you want, or like I was saying, we can click the save button and I can save this out to my curb file. It's a JSON file. It's a universal file type. It's text-based. You can even edit this stuff in Notepad after the fact if you want. And then if you're in a new drawing and you don't have any families in here, you can go click the load family and I can go out and load grading families. And where this path goes to, you can even set this in your options. What's the grading family's default path? And in fact, this path, this feels like your company profile a lot. This is just stored in some of the user preference files and the XML files. All that stuff can be deployed with the CIM Project Suite so that when you send this out to users, this path is already set for them, and perhaps a whole bunch of gradient families that you defined already or some of the CAD team defined, those are all already available to people. Let's look at some of these settings here. We talked about the surface settings. Right? A lot of times the detail around our curbs, something like this, it really makes a difference. And I want to highlight a feature about surface management with Autograder that really makes it a time saver. Perhaps there's more detail in your surface than that, right? You want more triangulation, or maybe you want less. What would you normally do natively? You'd have to go and remove the break line set from your surface and then add all those break lines back in. So what we can do with Autograder is we just jump into there, and we look at our surface settings over here, and instead of 0.2, let's say we wanted 0.05. The lower the number, the mid-ordinate, will give me more triangulation along curves. So I hit OK, I'll click Run again, and it's going to refresh that break line set in my surface so that I get more detail along there. Okay. Again, you'd spend a ton of time removing all that stuff, adding it back in. It manages all of that stuff in your surface for you. Now we talked about Autograder being real dynamic, right? Let's go make a change to our site. Let's grab this this main flow line here, it's grading at a 2%. Instead of at a -2, I'm going to switch it to a -1. Okay, what's that going to do? It's going to bring that grid surface up. If I take a look at my parent feature lines, in fact, let's grab all of these. I'm pushing the limits. I'm going to look at all of this in Object Viewer. Obviously, you guys would know what's going on with your drawings, but I just want to give you the visual so you understand what's going on here. Okay, we took that swale line that was running down the center, right, and we put it at a 1%. And so what did it do? It took my salmon-colored parent line, which is my gutter line, and it brought that up, right? So now, of course, all my curves are screwed up, right? The curve, like the whole parking lot is off, right? This is where Autograder comes in again. It's not just about creating the feature lines in the first place. It's about dynamically updating them when something in your site changes. I'm going to escape out of this. What would you normally have to do? You'd delete all these feature lines and re-offset them. It's crazy, right? So with this, you come in here, you click Run, give it a few seconds. It'll update all those feature lines. Or if you happen to draw new parent feature lines on the layer, okay, it would update all of those as well. Close out of this. Let's see, do I need to rebuild my surface? Let's take a look here. Maybe it did update for me. Let's save it and take a look at it. And this is an important point I want to make here, right? Is that we're trying to build a tool that updates with you. It's not just some tool that automatically creates a whole bunch of feature lines, right? But it updates, right? So now it's updated, right? All of those, the lip, the top, the back of curve, everything has moved with those parent feature lines. So whether you use a setup surface like I did or not, all of the child feature lines, the green ones, are basically stuck to the parent ones based on the Autograder family. Now, it doesn't mean you can't use Autograder and then go edit this stuff after the fact, okay? There's nothing dynamic about this feature line to that one. We've simply saved instructions in Autograder such that when you run it again, it will update those. So we've tagged these feature lines. We know if they're ones generated by Autograder, but they are just normal feature lines. Let's move on. Let's take a look at this pond here. I think, by the way, I think parking lots and curb and all the complexity that comes with that is one of the main areas I think that Autograder really shines. If you take advantage of a setup surface, even just preliminarily, to get some grades to those base feature lines or those parent feature lines, it can take the speed and the relative kind of dynamic nature of your model and just really improve it. So we've got a polyline right up here. This is going to represent our pond, baseline in our pond. I'm going to take this, I'm going to create a feature line out of it. I'm going to put in that same parent, that grid and parent site. I'm going to assign elevations, but this time there's no grid surface to stick to. I'm just going to start at a flat elevation of 830. I think that's a decent starting point. That should work for now. Okay. And by the way, we don't have it baked in there right now, but what we're going to have in Autograder is the ability to not just reference previously created feature lines, but also polylines. So I won't even have to run that step that I did right there. It's not a big deal, create a feature line out of it, right? But we decided we're going to add that right in here too, so that as you run a filter where you select things in the drawing for your parent feature lines, you can reference polylines as well as feature lines, and then Autograder will turn those polylines into feature lines and obviously prompt you with some information about starting elevations for those parent feature lines. So let's define a new family here. This is going to be a parallel one again. And call it the pond. I can select in drawing. Let's go ahead and do that this time. Pick this feature line. One feature line. And I create a new component. This will be just my first slope. I'm going to go a distance at slope. And this time, because it's a closed feature line, right, the concept of left and right is kind of lost, and inwards or outwards makes more sense. So we're going to go inwards at a distance of 8 and a slope of negative 33%. I'm going to do another component. This will be a bench, and I'm going to anchor this to the slope. Still go distance at slope, going to go inwards again, and this will be 2 feet and negative 10%. By the way, some of you listening, you work in metric, some of you in foot. Autograder is not dependent on units, so whatever your Civil 3D and drawing is set up to, Autograder works with that. That goes for all of our tools, for that matter. And we'll do one more slope right over here. Connect it to the bench. Go inwards again. We'll go 4 feet and negative 33%. Now notice some of these other commands. There's a couple arrows here. Okay, this is just to change the component order. And as you do that, you can see the preview down here. It gives me a little tag with what each thing is. Here's the parent right up here. Slope 2 is that one I just defined, but now put in second in the list. So if I send that back down, slope 2, it should update. That's some of the stuff we're working on here. A couple weeks from release. Looks like it's not updating, but you get the idea. It should build right. Okay, let's go into our formatting here. What do we want for the slope? All of these are going to be child, and we're going to take that same child feature line, and we're going to put it into the AG generated, Autograder generated site. Now, if you don't have any of this interaction going on, you can put everything in the same site. But I need to use sites a little bit to manage the crossing of feature lines with this grid surface and the parking lot curb lines. If you think a little bit about what we're doing here, right, we're automating the creation of many, many feature lines. And so this layering and styling is important. If you end up throwing these feature lines on the same layer as the parent feature lines, for example, what do you think is going to happen, right? Autograder will catch it, but right, you've got to think about layers and styles when you're setting this up a little bit so you can keep things separate, especially if you're using filtering to grab a set of parent feature lines. When you're using sites, think about the interaction of the child feature lines with the parent ones. Do you want that site type interaction or not? You can ignore sites altogether if you don't want any interaction and use the none site option. But anyway, something to think about as you're using this on your projects. So we're going to hit save to this. We're going to come out, we're going to add this to the same surface. This is a real cool thing. You define these different components, but they're really all part of the same site, right? They're all part of the finished grade surface. Let's choose a little bit bigger mid-ordinate distance and a supplementing factor of 10. I'm going to click run to this. Generates all those feature lines for me. Adds everything to the surface. Okay. And again, everything's real dynamic, right? So any changes that happen, a simple refresh and Autograder, and all of the child feature lines will update with it. Let's take a look at this berm over here. Let me show you kind of how fast this can be, right? If this stuff is templated out, you have some standard pond designs and curb designs, right? I simply come in here. If it's not loaded in my drawing already, I can open this, load the berm template. I can jump into that. All right, back to our site here. We'll make sure we get that pond rebuilt again. Come into the pond family. Let's go and pick that. I'm going to turn this into a feature line first. Getting a little bit ahead of myself. Didn't realize that part didn't save. So we had assign an elevation of 830 on this. By the way, one question that came in, can you do daylighting from ponds? Absolutely. We can do it from ponds. We can do it from your back of curb. We can do it from anything. In fact, that's what I'll get to. I'll do this pond and this berm quick, and then I'll show you the daylighting or the slope or targeting of a surface option as well. Let's create these objects here. The pond will come in here. We want to pick this feature line. Got all my same settings for styling, layer in there. Click run on the pond. Okay. I'm not going to load that berm family. I'm not sure what was going on there. Let's just create a new one. And we'll keep it fairly simple. We'll grab this guy out here, although we have to turn it into a feature line. And create a new component that's just going to be a slope. And we're going to go outwards at a distance of 15 feet and a slope of negative 15%. So you can save this. You don't have to necessarily activate this stuff. You can save it, do some work in your drawing, and then come back to it. Like this, right? Creating a feature line. Let's put that at 839 for a starting point. And then back in Autograder, go into that berm family. Now we can pick that feature line. This is the feature I was talking about where, it would create the feature line from a polyline for you. Create our surface settings. And by the way, you can make copies of families so that things like surface settings and everything are replicated from one family to the next. I'll hit run to this. And there's our berm over there. And all the while, everything still remains dynamic, right? Dynamic with a refresh of Autograder, right? So that all the changes to this kind of stuff, right? Grip edit changes on anything. Maybe there's some curb changes over here. We decided I needed a couple more parking spots, right? So you're grabbing your parent feature lines, and those are what you're editing. Okay. All the child feature lines are updated automatically. So I made changes to all three different families there. Let's launch Autograder again. The pond, the berm, and then this curb down here, right? We should see all that update. So I can click run all down here. And it's going to run through all the families again. I mean, depending on how many feature lines you're creating, it might take 10 seconds or so, but right, the effort involved otherwise is pretty substantial. So that curb change, the pond, and then the berm as well. Okay. Let's talk about grading limits a little bit, right? You've seen me create these different components on my site, right? And a lot of times they're easy to template out like this. But then there's the whole daylight to surface thing, right? And a lot of us use the grading tools, and in fact, will blow away or explode the grading object to be left with the feature line, right? Because that daylighting functionality is a fairly complex thing. Well, we've baked all of that into here as well. And you can do it any way you want, okay? I could take this parent and I could daylight from this for a certain station range out like this. Or maybe you want a little more space and I want to kind of define a buffer out here. And then I could just daylight from that parent feature line. Whatever you do, you can daylight from any feature line to any surface. So I'm going to give you an example here where I'm going to sketch out a polyline here that are kind of some initial grading limits. It's a way that I've liked to work often. And this isn't my daylight line, but perhaps it's maybe an initial kind of berm across my site, right? And we can daylight from this. Let me show you what I mean here. We're going to connect right to our back of curve there. Okay. I'm going to create a feature line from this. Just native functionality here. Then we're going to pull elevations from my existing, but just as a starting point. I'm not going to make it relative to it, just to get a sense of where existing grade is. And I'm going to kind of exaggerate the changes in elevation here so you guys can kind of get an appreciation for the daylighting and how we'll handle it. But except for the endpoints, let's go ahead and raise this stuff up a little bit. Let's bring it up a few feet. So we're kind of creating a berm right there so that we get all that drainage coming into our pond. I can make a couple edits here as we see fit. Maybe that feature line here, right? So you're defining some general grading limits. This is, I mean, even without Autograder, this is an approach I've used where you have kind of not just your daylight line off your main components, but some kind of middle line there where you then daylight from that. Okay, so we've got that. Let's go and put this on the grading limits layer. Notice I had it on the curb layer. If I leave it on the curb layer, what's going to happen next time I run my curb family? It's going to get pulled in and it's going to build curb on all that. So that's some of the layer and style management I was talking about. Let's come back to Autograder. We're going to define a new family again. It's going to be a parallel one. And it's going to be the northeast grading limits. I'm just going to pick feature line on the drawing. And it may not be a lot of components. You know, maybe you want to grade for a little bit and then daylight, or maybe you just want to daylight from this line right off the bat. Again, there's a lot of ways you can do this. It could be on this whole feature line. It could have been a station range along this pond. Tons of scenarios. We're going to do a slope to surface. Okay, so we have two surface options in here, slope to surface and a distance to surface. Distance is like a constant horizontal offset that attaches to the surface, meaning the slope will vary. Whereas a daylight is more, that's like what the slope to surface is, where you get a constant slope, but the offset from the parent feature line varies. So we'll do a slope to surface. We're going to go on the left side because I started drawing that over here, so I know it's on the left side. Then I'm going to target my existing surface. And then if I come into here, we've got settings on how that daylight line is created. In fact, how much detail there is. So this is an area where we've actually gone above and beyond what any native tool sets will do there to give you the right amount of control on daylighting. So along line segments, I can say, project every 10 feet. On curve segments, I can have it go by mid-ordinate distance if I have a lot of varying radii across my curves, or I could just do the same as that, okay? Now these are supplementing, right? So if I check this on, that means it's going to add additional vertices beyond what exists in the parent, okay? Some of these vertices I created in the parent feature line, those were, they might be 50, 100 feet apart. Well, I don't want to daylight just at that distance. I want to daylight every 10 feet. It's kind of like corridor frequency. Think of it that way. How often do you want to daylight? And then if you have, if you're daylighting from say a sharp 90-degree corner like this, that's considered a bend. How would it daylight around a bend? And that is defined by an angle in here. We don't really have much of that going on, so there isn't much to supplement. But if you did, you could say, daylight every 10 degrees, every 15 degrees. So kind of like the grading creation tools, it would wrap around that bend and not miss anything around that. So a lot of control on how it daylights to your surface. I'm going to go at a 25% slope for 4:1. By the way, you can type in 4:1 and it'll run that math on you. So however you're used to typing it in, it'll take it and run the conversion. Check out our formatting, make sure it's what I want it to be. I should have been going to those options to default this for the whole drawing, but okay, and up here, here's where I now have that range option. I could do the full or I could do a range. So I could say for half of this daylight at 25% or 4:1, and then another family I could define daylighting from a 3:1, for example. We're looking at baking in different transition options in here as well, where you could say daylight from 3:1 here, 4:1 there, then transition. I'm not sure we'll have that kind of stuff right in this initial release, but it's something we're going to bake into the application. So I'm going to hit save and close. We'll add this to the finished grade surface. We'll dial up our supplementing factors a little bit. Again, we'll do 0.3 on those curves. Now I'll click run to this right here. And it runs that daylight. Let's go and take a look at that. There's those distances, 10 feet, right? It's picking up the vertices in the parent feature line, but we're also supplementing in this way so that it's daylighting not just at those parent feature lines, right? So that it really depends on what you're working on. Is it a small little detailed site like this? Is it a giant airfield? Is it a landfill? Right? Depending on the size of your site, a vertex every 5 or 10 feet, that gets to be a lot in a giant site, right? But something detailed like this, we want more frequency, we want higher frequency, okay? And just like the other stuff, everything is dynamic so that as things are changed, right, if we went over the property line there and you move some of this around, maybe the pond needs to move a little bit. Launch Autograder. I'm just going to run these two families. First, the daylight one. That'll refresh, and we'll refresh our pond family as well. Close out of there. Okay. So daylighting, really cool. We've got it built into here as well. We knew we had to do that because running offsets, be they parallel or perpendicular, that's a big part of it, but we've got to have that daylighting functionality in here as well. I want to mention one thing in the surfaces. If we take a look at this, here's all those break line sets I created. In fact, it's taking the name of the family. You can customize the name, but it takes this name right here. And it's managing this, meaning every time I run or refresh that family, it doesn't go and like add a new break line set and duplicate all this stuff. So anything that's being managed by Autograder, it'll be taken care of in your surface. Now some of you are asking, sweet Brian, that's cool and everything, but not everything fits into a template. Sometimes I just need to draw a feature line and put a break line in there, right? Some things you can't automate. There's really no relationship to anything else, right? You want to create some kind of swale in here, or like this right here. It's supposed to be a little concrete pad out here. This surface isn't off limits from standard Civil 3D commands, okay? The only thing we're doing in this surface with Autograder is controlling just those break line sets that we've created. So I can take this thing. This is to be a building, a little concrete pad for it's an outdoor break space or something. Propelled elevations from existing to start, and just raise this up a little bit. Okay. And just like you're used to now, I can add this into my FG surface. And it all behaves just like normal. And nothing is affected, meaning I can, again, make those kinds of changes to my Autograder definitions, if you will. I can make those kinds of changes, and it won't affect the manually created stuff. Because we know we can't automate or templatize everything you do in here. Sometimes it's a very iterative kind of thing, right? So we're going for maybe 80–90% of your stuff can be automated through Autograder, but you're still going to have a few things here and there. So if I open this up, I run the curb family again. Right, it's going to refresh everything based on those settings, update the surface. Okay, and it didn't touch anything over here. What about grading limits down here? Okay. Okay, anything you need to do standard, go ahead and do your surface. Let's go ahead and grab a few of these. Say we're matching into this existing back of curb. We've got simply a feature line for the building. Can add this stuff into FG. Okay, I can put boundaries on here. We want to add a height boundary at the building. Not that high boundary. Right? So any manual operations that you're used to, we can still do all that. But we can automate all the ones that you want in the same way. Okay? This is kind of what I want to show you guys today. A few other things we've got coming with this. We're going to have a little more control on that daylighting frequency. We're looking to build in some automated surface boundary stuff. So like right here, it's pretty easy to delete those lines out of there or create my own surface boundary. But we're going to look to automate some kind of shrink wrapping around this so that it would trim that stuff up for you automatically. So a few questions, additional ones came in. Is there a provision for vertical walls, right? You may have noticed there are all the same break line settings you would normally have. Those are right in here. So if you were talking about a wall break line, yes, that option is still in here, and you can do that, and these wall factors down here apply to that. If you're talking about being able to create truly a vertical wall on your surface, we can't do that. A surface won't let you have a vertical face to it. But if you weren't doing it with your break line setting, it's kind of an odd thing there, but you might just define a family. Like if you're trying to grade to bottom of slab in the building there, and you wanted to create that vertical face along the slab or the basement wall there, if you create a new family, you'd want to do something like distance to elevation and give it a slope. slope to elevation and give it a slope that's really steep, basically approaching vertical. That's how you would generate vertical faces in this way. But like I said, a surface by its very definition cannot have a vertical face. So you can approximate walls in this way or with the break line settings. So another question came in, if you have a property line, at the boundary limit, in fact, this is kind of what I showed here, how do we daylight to that, right? Well, if you have a property line there and there's existing grades you have to tie into, and you already have that geometry defined, it's just a matter of creating a feature line like we had, pulling those elevations from existing grade and throwing it in the same surface. So I think what I did here is what you were after, right? So it's not so much a daylighting, but it's a matching into a predefined grading limit. You do like I did here. You just grab those feature lines, draw them if you don't have them, and add them in. But there's nothing like really to automate there, right? Thanks, everyone. Have a wonderful day. Have a wonderful week. Stay safe out there in our new crazy world. I wish you the best, and we will see you next week at the Label Genie webcast. Take care.